Hello, everybody. Hope you had a great second day. I'm very happy to be here with three of our guests. So we have Jean-Jacques Orban de Xiri. He is in the Department of Movement Sciences at the KU Leuven in Belgium. We have our Athena Akrami, who is at the Sainsbury Wellcome Centre at University College London in the UK. And we have Aldo Faisal, who is also at the University College London, but in the Department of Bioengineering.
Imperial College London.
Imperial, sorry.
We're the competition.
We are friends.
I always get confused between them. I'm so
You're
sorry.
all University London.
But you're both in London, right? There's no two different Londons in the UK. Okay, good. Whew, I got that one right. Okay, so welcome for joining us all. Maybe we can get started with you telling us something about what you do, and so that our students get to know you a little bit. Jean-Jacques, do you want to start?
Yes, sure. Well, I guess to define myself, I can read my Twitter bio because I'm very active on Twitter, and so it simply says that I'm an engineer working on movement neuroscience in a movement science department at KU Leuven in Belgium. And I think with that, you have a good overview of what I am. So more specifically, I study the process of motor adaptation and how aging affects motor adaptation. I do that via computational studies, behavioral studies, brain stimulation studies, and also starting some EEG studies. So quite a diverse set of tools that I use for my research.
Awesome, thank you. Athena, you already got the chance yesterday, but for those of those students that haven't maybe dialed in yesterday, do you want to give us a brief overview of who you are as well?
Yeah, sure. My Twitter bio is not very informative, so I can tell you briefly that my undergrad background is engineering, biomedical engineering, but then I got interested, I was interested in brain, but then soon realized that my interest is more in kind of a scientific questions about the brain than just like, kind of an engineering type of finding some outputs from our current knowledge. So then I studied computational neuroscience during my PhD. I worked with attractor models, and then soon realized that I would like to have more kind of a direct hands in the phenomenology of the type of questions I am working on. So I became experimentalist during my postdocs. So now in my lab, we basically have a full loop of designing experiments based on questions related to memory, inference, learning, statistical learning, and then try to set up hypotheses from either mechanistic models or normative models and test them on rats, mice, human, and yeah.
Awesome, thank you. Aldo, do you want to give us your spiel?
Sure. So I'm generally interested in the algorithms that allow us to, generate skilled, interesting behavior. And from a perspective of working on these algorithms, I don't mind whether these are algorithms in a robot or algorithms in a human. What I'm interested in is how top-level constraints arising from the tasks that an organism or a machine needs to execute, how this influences how we should choose algorithms and representations for learning and controlling these tasks. And from a bottom-up end, I'm interested in how physical constraints in the nervous system or in the biology of the systems limit what type of solutions we can pick. And so in my career, I've started working at the very low end of things. I've worked on axons and ion channels. I've worked on insect motor control, then graduated to human motor control and decision-making. And basically, the use of fairly advanced statistical machine learning methods has taken over more and more of my work. And so now we're ended up very much at the cognitive end of working with humans. And the interesting thing is what's important to us is we just don't model things. We also want to build solutions that implement something practical that you can apply in medicine, in brain-computer interfacing, for example. And so for us, this closing the loop with building a system is an inherent part of understanding a system.
Great. So as you know, today the students learned about how to approach modeling and sort of went through a 10-step guide. Maybe can you briefly share with the students what your approach to modeling is? Where do you start? What do you do typically? Aldo, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think I'm not giving you a textbook answer because it really depends on where you're coming from. Do you have an idea in the modeling domain and that you want to then find a biological system where you can apply this idea and try to see whether the idea captures something meaningful in the real world? I would take a very different domain of where I'm confronting with an interesting contradiction in the data or something complicated in the data that I want to explain in a simple way. So if I'm coming from the theory end, I'm trying to basically reduce the idea to the simplest possible essence so that I can really talk to you about it while we meet on the corridor for 30 seconds. And then so that I can engage many different experts in many different domains, be it mouse biology, be it human biology, and basically see whether it resonates something, whether there's a meaningful application for that. And that's really the first step. Does my abstract theoretical idea have any practical purpose or purchase? And on the other hand, sometimes when you're just confronted with very complex data, you're then asking, okay, what are the underlying simplifying principles that I can apply? And again, here, you need to go back into your understanding of the biology of the system and see what constraints you know about the biology of the system to simplify the complexity of the problem of this data.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Athena, what is your approach?
Okay, so our lab is basically a kind of a systems neuroscience lab. And I know that there are various definitions of systems neuroscience. My definition is that we start from a kind of a cognitive question, right? We are interested in some aspects of the behavior and cognition. And then we try to really kind of break it down into addressable components and then use different tools in order to understand that. I know that, again, the word understanding can be very confusing and it can be very, and there is no kind of a convergence about what do we mean by understanding. But like abstracting out some details and kind of being, my example is that imagine that I kind of ask you, how does a pinhole camera works, right? And if you tell me, I mean, you can really just start from the concept of a dark room, right? Like there is a hole and it projects the images into back of the room. You are not going to tell me any more details about what is the material of this box, what is the color of the box, the size of the box, right? So we have to really abstract out some details and really get to the minimal description that explains that system. So in my lab, we also we're interested in questions about like, how do we learn structures in the world in a kind of an unsupervised manner? And then try to really, we have to, at the end of the day, break it down into smaller steps. And that smaller step sometimes is just like falls back into purely kind of computational theoretical approaches, right? We really would like to kind of have a neural network that is going to learn a simple a task in an unsupervised manner. But then because we are also working with rats and mice and human, we try to find some sort of some aspect of that abstract model that we can collect some data in the real system and then go back again and modify the original model. So it's a very kind of a constant loop between we gain some intuition, some insights from generic frameworks that I mean, probably that is very kind of a personal choice. I like normative models. I like Bayesian statistics. I like maybe attractor dynamics, right? And then in that framework, we try to define some questions that can be tested in the real systems, and then go back and refine those original ideas.
Great. Thank you, Athena. JJ, how do you approach modeling?
Yeah, I think for me, it all starts from a question or something that I don't understand in the data or that does not make sense, either in my data or in papers that I read. And then I'm like, okay, how can I make sense of this result given what we know? And that's often for me the start of the modeling approach, where I'm like, okay, this doesn't make sense to me. It does not fit with the framework I have in my head. If I try to model that, am I able to do so? If I take, a model of like motor adaptation, can I reproduce this phenomena in such a model? What type of model would I need? What are the minimal assumptions that I need to be able to reproduce that? And sometimes it's possible with a simple model to make sense of what was found, and sometimes it's not. And that's often, the start of an adventure. I think I've basically produced many more models that I never published than the ones that I actually published. It's because it just helps me to make sense of things that I don't understand. And so that's really the idea. And the tools that I use then are the tools that are used in my field, often state space modeling, optimal controls, and stuff like that, and trying to make sense of results, trying to see what do I need to change in a model to reproduce that, or is it even sometimes not possible to reproduce that, which means that I can still not make sense. And that's often the start of a long path towards researching what the answer is.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, I think everyone has had enough time to ask questions, so we'll go through them. So first question is by Sunidhi. Hey, in the tutorial 3.2, thresholding the self-motion vestibular signal, why are we taking the last value of each child's vestibular signal as an estimate of self-motion velocity? Why the last? Okay, I think I have to answer that because I was intimately involved in the development of the tutorial. And the answer is really very simple. The vestibular signal, the raw vestibular signal, is an acceleration signal. So when you integrate that acceleration signal, so you essentially, when you integrate, you accumulate, right, in the acceleration signal. You get velocity when you do that. But it doesn't make sense, really, to choose at a particular time point, especially an early time point. You want to make a judgment after some time of observing the sensory input. And we have chosen the end of the 10-second period of data that we gave you, but that can be something different, of course. You can say, well, maybe it only takes a second to figure it out, and then you can make the judgment after the second, right? So this was a very simple model for you to walk through, and we've made some fairly arbitrary choices if you want. But the idea here is simply that we wanted to have all the possible information available that we accumulate and integrate and make the judgment based on that. Okay. Next question. Why do biological systems have noise? Does it also serve some evolutionary purpose? Okay. Who wants to answer that? Aldo.
I'll go for that. So biological systems have noise, I think, first of all, because noise in any information processing system is a given of the laws of physics. Any single processing component has some form of inherent noise, ultimately coming all the way back from quantum mechanics. In neurons, you have noise because you have proteins that basically are subject to thermodynamic noise. You have noise because signals and synapses are subject to diffusion of neurotransmitters, and you've noise all the way to the level of behavior. The reason why can it make an accurate reach very quickly from one point to the next is because you have variability in how you're recruiting your muscles and how the nervous system scales up signals over many orders of magnitudes, from molecules to a scale of a meter. So noise is unavoidable. The question is now, how much of noise that we're seeing in the world of the brain is used for meaningful purposes? So there's this old idea of what we call, and I'm blanking here on the term, Gunnar, please fill in, you know what I mean. It's a sensory enhancement, stochastic resonance. That is a way for bringing low subthreshold signals over the threshold. And there's been some evidence in sensory neurons, for example, in sharks, that show that these effects can be used. More interesting is the use of noise for processes of computation. And here, when you're trying to build systems that can infer things from data, what you're encountering is methods that we call Monte Carlo modeling, and I'm sure you'll hear more about this, as well as so-called inference by sampling. And so these are algorithmic aspects that are powered by some form of random number. So there could be uses for this noise that the brain may exploit to improve things. But ultimately, think about where creativity comes from. Where can you do things that you have not thought or conceived about before? And maybe all our creativity is nothing else but rolling the dice in some form of structured way to come up with new solutions.
That's very thought-provoking. Athena, do you want to add something to that?
No, I agree with all the points that Aldo said. I just wanted to add maybe 2 comments. One is that the first thing is that the definition of noise. A lot of times when we are dealing with biological system, we call something that we really don't know what is the source. We just call it noise, right? Because on the opposite side, signal is what we know really what is the source. We have the control over, we have a good prediction of the behavior. So we have just more knowledge about that aspect of the information. But noise is just something we really don't know. And if we really dig more carefully into that, we a lot of times, I don't know, for instance, like when there are we are averaging spike trains over different trials, right? We come up with like some average firing rate that would represent maybe average behavior, average output of the brain. But if you really look more carefully into that, there are trial to trial variability. And then that at the level of trial, we are able to use that something that we were calling noise in a kind of a meaningful manner that would just produce slightly different behavior, right? So that's one thing that we should be careful when we are talking about noise. Sometimes it's just about some unknown information or signal in the brain that we still don't know how to categorize it. And then second is that delving more into the last point by Aldo about creativity, I think like noise, yeah, it's very good. Like some intuition from physics, from statistical mechanics is like when there is this kind of when you are stuck into a basin of attraction, for instance, right? Some thermal noise would just like would push you out of that state, right? It's like something. Sometimes you probably realize that, oh, I'm blanking on something. I cannot really think clearly, right? I'm just stuck into some thought, right? At that moment, you really need noise in order to get out of that state, and that's very important for you to put you some other kind of a new part of the new state space in order to explore other things and not just always getting stuck into your existing state, mental state, or that probably is going to reflect back into some real kind of a low-level biological details. But at the mental state, you need some sort of a kind of a thermal noise to get out of the sticking states.
Yeah, that was a great question, and it's actually like a very active research field as well. People, sorry, I hope I'm not taking the words out of your mouth here, JJ. Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, maybe to summarize, you can really see 2 categories of noise. One is detrimental to behavior, the fact that you cannot reproduce twice exactly the same behavior, even if you would like to. And some, as Athena just mentioned, is really helps you to explore the environment. I think that's really 2 broad categories. That's a kind of summary of what Aldo and Athena said before.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have another very interesting question. How would you approach data-driven versus hypothesis-driven projects with regards to the proposed guidelines? This is a question of Eugene Tretiakov. Who would like to answer that?
I think JJ should go first this time.
You're on the spot, JJ.
Yeah, thanks, Aldo. Yeah, I mean, it's I think it's a difficult question. To me, it really depends what you mean with data-driven. I think that's not specified. But if you collect a lot of data, what's your goal? Okay, you have a lot of data you want to model, but what's the ultimate goal of your model? I think that's important to decide. If you have hypothesis-driven project, it means more to me that you want to make the distinction between two or more different hypotheses, and so that the model will tell you, or hopefully will allow to tell you, well, this is possible, this is not possible. So I think it's not especially the last stage of the proposed process that are different. It's really the way you frame the question that is very different. You could use the same model for a data-driven approach or for a hypothesis-driven approach, but it's really the way you frame the question that will be different, I think, in these two type of projects.
Aldo?
So just a bit of controversy in here. I'm going to disagree with JJ. So what I think is, I think there's fundamentally different ways of thinking about modeling. So one is what I call modeling, where you come in from first principles and tries to add as few elements as possible to build something that recreates the description of data, generates data the way that is consistent with what you're seeing in the world. And that's very interesting if you want to understand what's the minimum elements, what are really the key features that I need to understand. At the other end, when you're being data-driven, one thing that is very important to me is that we're trying to completely ignore human preconception, what we call the induction bias, of how I think a problem is structured. And instead, basically, let the data tell us what is the most important thing. So I give you an example. Many years ago, we had a question, what are the most important hand movements? And people wrote for 200 years treatises on what are the most important hand movements. And people say this, and this is the most important hand movement. We actually started 10 years ago to measure people's movements in everyday life with data gloves. And then we found that this movement is hardly ever executed, like 0% of all hand movements are this movement here. And so a lot of our preconception of what we think is important, how we build prosthetics, how we build robotics, is built on assumptions made by humans. And so when I'm data-driven, and I'm decidedly in a different mindset when I'm data-driven, I want to throw out as much as possible about assumptions and use as much as the constraints that I put on how my model fits the data to find some structure in there. But I want to eliminate this human induction bias. And that's fundamentally different from bottom-up modeling, where say, this rule and this rule and this rule needs to be in there, and I want to see whether it can recreate the problem in the data.
Can I add a little bit of?
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, so again, just as a person who has computational background, now running experimental lab, every day we run into this problem of, should we just like collect data and run experiments, or we should first have a full model and then create hypotheses and then go to do experiment? And it's a very hard question. I think the important thing, as both JJ and Aldo mentioned, data-driven approaches are very valuable because we really need to know the phenomenology. We really need to know some output from the system. Otherwise, we just like we will work on based on our presumptions, and that sometimes can be wrong. But the important thing, I think, is that after we collect data, what are we going to do with it, right? Unfortunately, a lot of the experiments, a lot of the studies finished after collecting the data and doing a first course of the first order analysis of the data. We stop there. I think that's the critical point, that out of that data, we should then try to create maybe, refine models, create new hypotheses, design new experiments. That's the important thing, not just like collect data, because maybe some of the studies can be divided into categories of how the brain looks like or how the brain works, right? So if we just collect data and we're happy with that, we will just end up having like a bunch of studies that would tell us how the brain looks like under different conditions that we ran these experiments. But if you really want to understand how the brain works, then we have to tie back these data-driven approaches into putting them into some kind of a formal models and kind of a theoretical maybe hypothesis.
Thank you. So I would like to add like a couple of words to this. So I think that whenever you do a modeling project, whether it's so-called data-driven or hypothesis-driven, you always have inherently some hypotheses or at least some questions, right? And I mean, Aldo said like, yeah, I wanted to know what the actual finger or hand statistics are. But I mean, the hypothesis that was out there was a essentially a hypothesis long stated that this is among the most, that's your hypothesis, among the most frequent. That's the thing that Aldo tested in a data-driven approach. So in a way, they're not that different. You're just coming into a set of questions with different tools and different from a different angle, essentially. But you always have a question. You always have a goal when you do either of them, either the formal modeling or the data exploration. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, so next. So this is again a question that relates directly to the tutorials. How do we come to the conclusion that the brain actually integrates vestibular signals? Is it possible that it compares the vestibular data, which are acceleration data, and the optical flow data, so velocity data, differently? So is that a possibility that can also be right? And that question comes from Yaswant Avers. Sorry. Who would like? Anyone would like to answer this? So I mean, yeah. So the main reason why we did it this way in the tutorial is essentially because we know that the brain integrates those signals for perception. There is multiple integration pathways in the broader vestibular system. So not just the one that controls the eyes, for example, for the vestibulo-ocular reflex, but also the ones that control balance, for example, that control perception of self-motion, et cetera, et cetera. So this is essentially why we did that. Now, are there other possibilities in principle? Sure. You can come up with an arbitrary amount of different things that you might want to do. Some filter. So integration is just a type of filter, right? So you can come up with another filter that doesn't do exact integration, for example, but does something else and still gives you an idea of what's going on. So yes, there is different options, but again, the goal here was not to explore those options. The goal was for you to go through the individual steps of how to actually think about modeling and build a model. Okay. Can you give us specific instructions or examples for peer programming? Sometimes it feels too time-consuming. That's an interesting one. Okay, that comes from Minu Shin. Does anyone want to have any opinion on peer programming? I mean, from the instruction perspective, I'll start. From the instruction perspective, peer programming is really the ideal thing to do. If you're a good programmer and you're fast with it, does it take more time doing peer programming? Yes. But that doesn't mean that you don't learn extra things by doing peer programming. And there's several advantages of that. One is that in the group that you're in doing the peer programming, you have a lot of complementary expertise. And peer programming essentially is angled or based on the fact that you exchange information, right? You talk things through, you discuss things. So there's a lot of information exchange among yourselves, and this should really increase the learning component for everyone. It also, if some of you are more expert in a certain field, is a really good way of actually solidifying the expertise. There's no better thing to actually knowing whether you have understood something than having to teach it and explain it to someone else. And so it has really multiple aspects, multiple advantages to use the peer programming. And yes, it's potentially a little slower sometimes for you, but you will hopefully find out that other times it's actually faster because you would not know on your own what to do and how to approach, and you could get unstuck by your group that way.
And I think oh, sorry, JJ, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, maybe what I wanted to add is it's one way also to explore the way to program, because sometimes you do something in a certain way, and by confronting how you do it with how someone else would do it, you can learn, oh yeah, there's another way of doing it, and maybe this one is more efficient. I think you learn a lot by looking at how other people program, and that can be very helpful, even if you're already at a good level. And I agree with all what Gunnar said. I mean, peer learning in itself is very, very good for you to answer the question of the other participants, because it will really force you to think about how you are doing it and why you are doing it?
So we ran a few years ago a course, or I ran a few years ago a course at my university, which was about biological and machine learning. And so we had people with biological background, not a lot of programming or math experience, and computer science students together. And we ran an experiment. And the experiment was we pair one biologist and one computer scientist in a pair programming tutorial where they had to solve problems. And then we just let the computer scientists do it on their own. And the biologists we put together in a group with experienced PhD students to help them. So the groups that consistently produced the best results in terms of the grade of the output that they produced afterwards were the peer programming groups. And ultimately, because when you're developing something new, it's not just the software engineering, it's also programming, especially if you analyze data or model data, is also model development. Is that the dialogue forces you to do things. And all I can say, watch the time people spend on the keyboard. You will get better results if you have the biologist having the keyboard in their hand over the highly technical guy, because the technical guy plays back, oh, I need to do this, and just shoots off, while the other one has to sort of think it through and know why they're doing it. And that is a very enriching exercise, especially if you're developing new concepts and new approaches to think about a problem.
Awesome. Okay, next we have a question from Luciano. Was today's simulated data a good representation of the physiological data that would be recorded from the same sensory systems? No, obviously not. We didn't give you actual neurons or spikes that we have somehow decoded. But we have chosen the levels of noise to be roughly consistent with what the kind of noise that physiologists would get in the decoding, for example, if they base it on a small population of neurons. And it's also consistent with perceptual judgment levels that are measured for vestibular motion, essentially. So in that sense, it's consistent, but yes, we did not give you the actual physiological signals, as in the spikes of the neuron. So in that sense, no, it's obviously not. It's not at the right level of detail in that sense. Okay. Next question by Patricia Rubish. How can you actually defend well a mechanistic model based on data which only show correlations and not necessarily causality? What would be the strategy here to avoid making huge mistakes in the hypothesis about the mechanism? That's a very interesting question. And just to preempt again, so we'll have in week 3, we'll have a whole day where you will talk about causality and what it means to obtain causality. But maybe we can already get some impressions here now. Who would like to give it a go?
I'm struggling to think of a mechanistic model, or at least what I mean, or I understand under a mechanistic model that is just driven by correlational data. Because typically to build a mechanistic model, i.e. where the elements are contributing to the effect that you're observing, I'm thinking Hodgkin-Huxley model of the action potential, you need to do targeted manipulations of the constituents component of the model, i.e. voltage step responses on ion channels, to gain a relationship, and that is necessarily a causal relationship. I'm really struggling to think about a mechanistic model, except maybe now with the COVID times, we have epidemiological models that model the spread of disease. So in some way they're mechanistic if they're modeling interactions between people going to different places. And there we just have correlational data. But again, these are still conditional data sets. So it's not clear to me whether you can have a mechanistic model without with just correlation-based data.
Yeah, I agree with Aldo. I think also that the correlation is often the result of your model. So you simulate your model and you get different parameters, different outputs, and then you can see whether those are correlated or not. But then you can kind of test as a first step, if I remove that part of the model, or do I get rid of the correlation between these two parameters and so on. But yeah, I also don't see a mechanistic model that would just be based on correlation. I think it can sometimes reproduce correlation as an output. That would be one way to say that the model is actually realistic, because it can reproduce known relationship, but that will not be the input of the model or what the model is based on.
I'm trying to read the mind of the person who wrote this question, and I might be completely wrong, but maybe what they meant was that, like, on one hand we have experimental data, and then on the other hand we want to propose a mechanistic model for that experimental data, and at the end of the day we will just look at the correlation between the output of our model and the experimental data. And while there might be tens of different models that would produce the same type of data, then the level of correlation is the same. How are we sure that our choice of mechanistic model is the right one? And it's a tough question. Yes, there are probably so many models that can be able to produce the same type of results. Maybe one way around that, is to, for instance, produce predictions, new predictions from your mechanistic models, or have a knob in order to kind of do some causal experiments after that from the prediction of your model in the real system, right? For instance, if you have I don't know, imagine that you build a neural network model that would do integration task in a decision making, right? And then so you are kind of creating a mechanistic model for the signal integration, and now you have a knob in order to just like change something in order to, for instance, like the synaptic time constants or the rule of some intermediate brain areas that would change the integration time, and then you can go and manipulate this real system and see whether the output would match again the experiment, the prediction of your mechanistic models. But these are really great questions, and these are the questions that, I mean, all of us scientists at different levels, we are dealing with these questions every day and trying to find the best answer.
Yeah, and remember, a model is an abstraction of reality, right? So in a sense, every time you model, what you do is you emit a hypothesis, right? A model is just a hypothesis. So if you reproduce a certain correlation, and that's all the data you have, with a model that's mechanistic, then you probably want to collect more data, make some predictions, and try to see whether the particular mechanism that you propose actually holds true, or whether it is one of the potentially infinite number of other mechanisms that you have not considered that actually is underlying the data. And so as such, tomorrow when you'll learn about model fitting and model comparison comes down to essentially testing between different hypotheses. Each model is a hypothesis, right? And then you can essentially numerically test under certain circumstances which hypothesis better describes the data. Okay, next question is by Ivan Orsulik. How do researchers experimentally confirm signal integration? By identifying a neural pathway and recording the signals on multiple points along the way, and then comparing the actual signal to the predicted values, or something else? Who would like to answer that? JJ, I think you might have an idea. Oh yeah, Athena, go ahead.
No, go.
But Jada, you might have an idea based on the Robinson work.
Mm-hmm.
On what, sorry?
The Robinson work.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert, obviously, in this integration of signals, so don't think I have anything intelligent to say about it.
Okay.
So I think
do you want to give it a go?
I mean, so one type of integration, again, I mean, the postdoc lab that I come from, Carlsberg in Princeton, a big part of that lab deals with evidence integration in decision-making tasks, right? The idea is that, for instance, maybe a lot of you have heard or seen some examples from monkey experiments started by Newsom and Chadlin, that there are these random dots moving on the screen, and then there is a kind of a coherent direction of motion in these random dots, right? So they are kind of noisy. Sometimes it's very difficult to understand whether the dots are moving to the left or right. Then you need to kind of collect visual information for a while. You have to stare at these moving dots, and then after some time you can realize, oh, this is the leftward motion or rightward motion. So you need to integrate evidence, and then this is basically kind of a starting point to think about the process underlying decision making as some sort of integrating evidence in favor of different choices. And so in Carlos Brody lab, yes, how can we then, I don't know, look for this integration signal in the brain? They haven't found it yet, and so it's not an easy answer. So the thing is that if you start from models, again, there are neural network models. There are some sort of a kind of a beautiful mathematical models in terms of drift diffusion model. You have a random particle that they move toward something, right? So then you have a kind of a particle that is accumulating evidences in favor of left, and then there are particles that are accumulating evidences in favor of right, and then they are competing until they kind of reach a bound, right? So, and you can translate these models, these mathematical models, very abstract, into some neural network, and you can have different types of neural networks. One network can do all the integration job for you, right? It's just like one layer, one population of neurons. They integrate the input, and the output is basically kind of a ramping signal. But you can have also some models that it's not that one neuron is ramping up. You may have just like different neurons that have some transient activity in different times, and then if you just add another layer to that and integrate all of sum all of these transient responses, you get a ramping increasing. And these are again hypotheses. Based on this hypothesis, you go and you look into the brain. You usually start from finding a brain area that might be important for the behavior, meaning that if you knock it out, then the animal cannot do this integration task. And then once you find that brain area, you go record from the signal and see whether the activity of the neurons show anything similar to this integration, either ramping or having these transient responses that once you sum them, then they look like ramping.
So basically, going back to the previous question, you confirm integration by doing a causal manipulation that effectively tests for the actual integration of the signal versus non-integration, right? And there needs to be clear causation of the signal on the integration.
That's great. And actually, again, just to foreshadow next week's program, you will have a whole day learning about how this works in terms of decision making. So hopefully that will clarify that question even more. We have another excellent question here, and I think that really is an important question. What are the most common biases you can make when building a model? And that's a question by Ravan El-Subai. I would like to give it a go.
I can go. And actually, I was distracted because this question was the first one on my list, and so I was already thinking on that one and not on the integration. So that's. And I actually like that one because what I think is that the most common bias is an experimental bias. It's actually that we are constrained by our own thinking, and we basically, if our lab think that or has some theory that we have developed over the years and so on, we tend to be very conservative and to build models that go together with our own theory. And so I think it's something very common in science, has been studied by many, many people. And so I think, to me, that's a very common bias, that people are basically constrained by themselves.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah.
I fully embrace that as well. I think confirmation bias is the biggest problem. It's either that you want to see your model to work, and very often you forget to evaluate other competing models. A big favorite. And the other one is going back to this thing about why should the brain or biology or whatever evolved our molecular and protein processes that build and make our brain operate? Why should you operate the way 20th century, 21st century biologist humans think, right? And I think this operation in human categories can be very, very detrimental, because we can think about building machines in very, very different ways, but biological brains look very, very different from most machines. An engineer or a human who devises a computing device will use copper cables. Nature uses salty water and fat as insulation and cable for building axons. So very, very different solutions. There's a very good reason for that, and we can discuss it separately. But I think we should try to take the human out of the equation to a certain extent. The human should ask the right questions, of course. But I'm just discovering how much bias there is in a lot of things that we're working on.
Athena, anything you want to add to that?
No, I agree with Aldo and JJ. Yeah, confirmation bias is the strongest bias. I mean, that's why that I think. I mean, I'm contrary to that too, but I really advocate, and I keep telling that to all trainees, that let's have at least 2 competing hypotheses at any moment in our kind of a scientific career, right? If we are working on a project on a question, let's at least have 2 competing hypotheses in front of us. They are still very limited. I mean, they are 2 out of probably infinite set of hypotheses, but it's better than 1, because we can then always find some evidence confirming that one hypothesis that we have. So, but if we work with 2, then we refute 1, or kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, in part of the reason why we developed the 10 steps how to model, in particular, the first 4 steps of framing the question correctly and thinking about hypotheses and thinking about ingredients, sort of from scratch, right, is exactly as one way to at least try to overcome some of this confirmation bias, some of the ingrained sort of like preferences that we might have, where we sort of see a phenomenon, immediately we think about, oh, this must be a Bayesian model for sure, because all I've ever done in my career is build Bayesian models, right? So for sure I'm going to use again a Bayesian model, because Bayesian models are magic and answer all questions in the world, right? So that kind of that's, of course I'm characterizing here, but that kind of thinking, that way of thinking is very dominant in the scientific field, not just in terms of modeling, but also in terms of experiments, right? Yeah. You tend to do the experiments for which you have the equipment in the lab, and you tend to think about, oh, what experiment could we do next based on the equipment you currently have in the lab and the expertise you have as a researcher. And very, like, in much fewer cases, people actually step back and just think about freely, what am I interested in, and how could I possibly, what's the questions I want to ask, and how could I possibly approach them sort of from scratch, right? Athena, you want
another thing? Yeah, just like I remember in the intro, Megan mentioned a very important point too, that just like fashionable models, right? Some models become fashionable, and then we feel kind of forced to adapt those fashionable models into our studies, and that can be dangerous, right? Sometimes they are important because maybe fashionable is just like something novel right now, right? And maybe they will give us some new insights, some real new insights. But if it's just because, yeah, we want to jump on the bandwagon, and we just like want to say that, yeah, we belong to the club too, that can be dangerous. So another thing, probably, I mean, it reflects more on the whole kind of a systematic biases in how the science is run, which is basically like a lot of labs, they compete for funding and grants, and they always want to create novel experiments. And by novel experiments, then that means that they are not going to finish the experiment 1 that they started, because if they just like continue that would somehow kind of count as some incremental work, right? Then they want to jump into a new topic, and that this jumping into a new topic again is good, but the side effect of that is that we are not going to have a full picture of the questions related to experiment 1 before starting the new experiment.
Great. There's a lot of questions here about the sort of technical details about the tutorial. Why did we do this? Why did we do that? So I'm not going to answer all of them, or actually I'm not going to answer any more of them, I think, because there's some other interesting questions here that we should answer before the hour is over, and that's coming up very, very quickly. Just as a reminder that in the tutorials, the specific choices we made for the model were somewhat motivated by the scientific background, by the knowledge of the field, but they were in a degree totally arbitrary and unimportant to the goal of the tutorials. The goal of the tutorials was really for you to walk through each individual modeling step and go from the beginning, from the phenomenon, the question, all the way to a publication in the 3-hour period. And so of course we cut lots of corners, and of course it's oversimplistic. And yes, you can ask many, many different questions about the details about that, but really that is not so much the goal. And therefore I hope that you understand that I don't want to spend too much time on that. So there's one really interesting question here that I think we should be talking about, which is, do you think modeling and experimenting should be done by separate groups or different people? And that's kind of like a provocative question, because all 4 of us on the panel here have both an experimental lab and do modeling at the same time. So who wants to start first?
So, okay, if I may start, being the oldest. So I think, I like to think of our lab as a theoretical lab that happens to build a lot of equipment for experiments and then runs their own experiments. Ultimately, because sometimes we need the data for our questions, and it's easiest to get them for yourselves. And we work therefore on human systems. I think normally, if you're in a system where you can do both, that's great. But I think a lot of animal systems, for example, in monkeys, in mammals, require a lot of work and understanding and a speciality there. So you will have necessarily some form of differentiation. Of course, there are highly effective computational, rodent labs, but I think the degree of freedoms that you have in asking questions is very different. So that's why I chose to work primarily when we do experiments on humans and collaborate with people who work with animals when necessary.
Yeah, I think it's really a skill or an advantage to have both skills, to be able to model data and to do experiments yourself. If you're only a modeling guy or woman, then you basically are constrained by the data that is available, and you have to ask people to maybe do experiments for you. If you are only an experimenter and you don't have the skill to do some modeling, then you also stuck, because sometimes you won't be able to answer some questions. So of course, it's good to have both skills. Other possibilities to collaborate, of course. And there are many such collaboration, and that should be, I think, make it more advantageous or seem better for people to collaborate together, because I think that's also the future. We should not be forced to collect our own data. I think we should make data available to others if others wants to play with it.
Athena, do you want to add something?
No, I agree with JJ and Aldo. Just saying that collaboration is probably the most important thing. Even if the experiments are run by different specialized research groups, because technique-wise, it's just impossible. As Aldo mentioned, it's difficult for a lab to do everything in different species and at different scales and levels. But the important thing is to collaborate and think together. That's probably that's the critical thing that unfortunately is still missing from a lot of research groups. But we all need to think about that. And a lot of theorists also still are kind of isolated, and they do the work on their own. And then a lot of times they don't understand maybe the experimental works. Experimentalists, they don't understand the theoretical works. Just like these, the communication should get stronger and fostered, basically.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Maybe just one thing to add is that at least as a theory person, it is often detrimental when you're too far removed from the data you're trying to model, because you do not correctly understand the constraints and the difficulties that have led to the recordings of the data, what the data actually really means. Like people recording from the brain of animals, like what are the constraints? Like, why is the data not cleaner? There's all kinds of different considerations. You think you're somewhere with your electrode, like how sure are you about this, etc., etc. And so really having a close interaction within the same person, or maybe across different people, between experimentalists and modelers, I think is absolutely crucial for the advancement of our field. Okay, so we're coming up to the hour, and I think we had a tremendous discussion here. Would any of you like to say some final words before we wrap it up?
Well, maybe we shouldn't be fooled by the model. Sometimes, if we're too disconnected from the data, we should also trust the data and not only the model. I think that's important.
I think, especially in the age of deep learning, this is a very wise words. But I think what gives me a lot of comfort for the future is the amazing amount of really good questions I've seen, both in the question thread, but also in the chat here. And keep asking questions is probably the most important thing, whether you do modeling or do other things in your life. And it's the right question asked that makes a much bigger difference than just a model applied.
And that will be very useful in your brainstorming as well
Yes.
later for the group projects, because that's exactly what you're supposed to do, is just ask questions in all directions.
Yeah, I'm really extremely positively surprised by the questions, the level of questions. That is very exciting. Yeah, continue that. These questions are exactly the questions that we that are maybe one stage or two stages kind of more advanced than you. We every day ask, and just and bring them into your brainstorming sessions and think about different project topics. We'll start today, so bring them into your pods and discuss them with your TAs, with your mentors, and just like continue throughout your career.
Perfect. Thank you so much for those final words. I hope you enjoyed the Q&A. Thank you for joining us, JJ, Aldo, and Athena. And we'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.